Hello there and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity settles in comfortably and the pace of discovery slows just enough to make room for softer thoughts. Tonight, we'll wander into a place that has fascinated people for thousands of years, a place where sunlight catches on ancient limestone and shadows linger in long, straight lines across the sand. It's a place most of us have seen in photographs, in documentaries, or maybe even in childhood books with bright illustrations of pyramids and pharaohs. But what we rarely think about is what waits beneath them. Deep corridors, hidden chambers, structures that sit under the surface, sealed away from the open air and preserved by the patience of geology. And tonight we're going to settle into that idea, slowly, gently, as if brushing away sand grain by grain. These pyramids, especially the ones at Giza, rise out of the desert with a kind of stern confidence. No rush, no hurry, no sign they've been waiting for anyone. Yet under that steady appearance is something far more mysterious. Cavities picked up by modern scanning technology. Caverns hinted at by explorers long ago. Passages built with an understanding of stone that seems surprisingly advanced. And the question that rises from all of this is simple but enormous. Could the secrets beneath the pyramids change human history? Not in a dramatic movie trailer way, with dramatic gasps and booming soundtracks, but in the quiet way real discoveries often do. A shift in understanding, a new piece of the story, a moment where we look at our past not as a series of assumptions, but as a landscape dotted with possibilities. But before we settle into those possibilities, I'd like to know something simple about you. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you curled up in bed with the blankets tucked around you, letting the day unwind slowly? Are you somewhere quiet, letting the sound of a calm voice replace the noise of your thoughts? Or perhaps you're somewhere bright and busy, letting this serve as a small island of stillness in the middle of a full day. Wherever you are, take a moment just to notice it. The light around you, the air in the room, the feeling of being here for a moment that belongs only to you. And if this gentle exploration ends up bringing you even a little comfort or curiosity, I'd be grateful if you gave the video a like or maybe subscribed. It helps this sleepy little corner find others who might need a quiet break. It's easy to forget how rare those breaks are, especially when the world moves quickly and expects us to keep pace. Here, there's no hurry, just the slow unwrapping of ideas. Now, when most people think about the pyramids, they picture what's above ground. Bright sun, huge stone blocks, a shape so distinct that even a child can draw it in a few simple lines. But what we're talking about tonight begins below all of that, under the visible architecture, under the familiar story of pharaohs, tombs, and mummified rulers, under the assumptions we often carry from school lessons or documentary narrators, down in the dark, cool layers beneath where the desert heat doesn't reach. There have always been suspicions about these hidden spaces. Early explorers wrote about drafts of air that didn't match the nearby passageways. They noticed the subtle echoes that suggested more depth than the known corridors accounted for. They found blocks that seemed out of place, almost like plugs inserted to hide something behind them. But at that time, all they had were oil lamps, ropes, and the bravery to squeeze into tight passages that would make many people today hesitate. They lack the tools we have now: ground-penetrating radar, Muon tomography, 3D reconstruction. With those, modern researchers have found voids that don't correspond to any mapped room. Some are tall enough to stand in, some are long enough to stretch quietly beneath the main structure, and while no one knows yet what those voids contain, the fact they exist suggests that the story of the pyramid still has pieces we haven't uncovered. And that has a way of making us rethink things we thought were settled. We're used to hearing that everything about the pyramids has already been explained, that the ancient builders used simple tools, clever planning, and a lot of labour. But the more we look at these monuments with precision scanning and updated understanding of geology, the more the ground beneath them becomes just as interesting as the limestone above. It's as if the pyramids are only half the structure, with the rest hidden under the desert, waiting for the right moment to be understood. For some people, the idea of underground chambers sparks excitement. For others, it brings a sense of quiet wonder, knowing that something has been sitting beneath the surface for thousands of years without being disturbed. In a world where most things feel temporary or constantly changing, the idea of something ancient remaining untouched can be strangely calming. It reminds us that the Earth holds stories much older than our daily concerns, stories shaped not by speed but by patience. The pyramids were built during an era of incredible organisation. Teams of workers, stone quarries, transport logistics, planning that required careful observation of the stars and seasons. But if there are hidden structures beneath them, it raises questions that stretch even further back. Were they part of a blueprint we haven't fully understood? Were they meant to store something, protect something, observe something? Or were they part of older natural formations that the builders worked around with intention and skill? Each possibility adds another layer to the idea that human history might still have surprises waiting for us. Sometimes people imagine that the mysteries beneath the pyramids would overturn everything we know. Lost civilizations, forgotten technologies, dramatic revelations. But real change in historical understanding usually isn't that sudden. It's more like noticing a new detail in a familiar painting, one that makes you reconsider how the whole scene was composed. Discoveries shift the timeline here and there. They add complexity. They encourage new hypotheses. They remind us that the past isn't a straight line. It's a textured surface, uneven and full of corners that still hold shadows. And the pyramids offer many corners. The bedrock beneath them was levelled with precision far ahead of its time. The subterranean chambers were carved with an understanding of stone tension and pressure that still impresses engineers. The placement of these structures aligns with directions and celestial events in ways that continue to spark debates among researchers. When you combine these above-ground achievements with newly identified underground spaces, it becomes clear that the builders weren't just stacking blocks into a predictable shape. They were designing something with depth, intention, and stability meant to last longer than any one lifetime. That kind of thinking brings us closer to them, not because it makes them seem mysterious, but because it makes them deeply human. They wanted permanence, they wanted meaning, they wanted to build something that could stand long enough to matter. As we drift into this topic, it's helpful to think about the experience of standing near the pyramids. People who've been there often describe the feeling of scale, not just in size, but in presence. The stones aren't polished or smooth, they're rough and weathered. Some still have the original casing at the top, giving a hint of the polished surface that once covered the entire structure. But it's the silence around them that many remember most. The way sound feels slightly dampened near such massive shapes. The way the desert wind carries its own steady rhythm. The sense that the ground itself remembers more than it reveals. That ground, the literal foundation of the pyramids, holds layers of limestone that formed millions of years before humans existed. Those layers contain fossils from ancient seas that covered this land long before it was desert. When the builders carved into it to create subterranean spaces, they were working with a record far older than their own culture. And when we investigate those spaces now, we're bridging those timelines again, past and present, separated by an almost impossible stretch of years, yet connected through stone that hasn't moved since it was carved. And as we continue this calm journey into what lies beneath, it becomes easier to settle into the idea that history isn't fixed. It breathes through discoveries. It shifts gently with new evidence. It expands whenever we find something that doesn't fit our assumptions. That's part of the reason people stay fascinated by the pyramids, not because they expect dramatic revelations, but because they know that anything this old and this carefully built still has more to tell. There's a kind of comfort in that, knowing that the world still contains quiet unknowns, knowing that even with modern technology and constant information, some mysteries remain patient. They don't rush us. They don't compete for attention. They simply wait for the moment when someone finally looks in the right direction. The desert has a way of holding stillness that feels deeper than silence. When people imagine the area around the pyramids, they often picture sweeping dunes and sunlit horizons. But what most don't expect is how the quiet settles over everything in a steady, almost patient way. There's no rush in the desert, no hurry in its movements. The wind may push a thin layer of sand across the ground, and the sunlight may shift gradually from gold to amber, but nothing here demands immediate attention. It's a landscape shaped by time measured in centuries rather than minutes, and that kind of pace draws its own kind of awareness. You begin to notice small details that would be easy to overlook in a busier environment. The sound of distant footsteps, the dry click of stones adjusting under heat, the faint movement of air as it runs along the surface of weathered rock. People often assume that the desert is empty, but the land surrounding the pyramids is anything but empty. It's full of layers, traces, and quiet indicators that something older than the structures themselves resides beneath the surface. There are slight shifts in elevation, subtle changes in soil density, patterns in the ground that don't match the surrounding terrain. Archaeologists and geologists have learned to read these details the way others read language, letting the environment reveal hints in its own steady way. Nothing shouts for attention here, but the information is there for anyone willing to listen carefully. This landscape has been walked by countless people throughout history. Workers from the ancient world, explorers, researchers, villagers, travellers, and now visitors who arrive with cameras, water bottles, and wide eyes. Yet despite all those footsteps, the ground still keeps its secrets close. Much of what lies beneath hasn't shifted in thousands of years. Sand may cover and uncover different patches with the changing winds, but the features cut into bedrock remain in place, holding their position through earthquakes, storms, and human curiosity. Some of the earliest documented explorations in the region describe unusual depressions or small openings that seem too intentional to be natural. Early travellers wrote about these features with uncertainty because they lacked clear explanations. They couldn't tell whether they were looking at entrances, collapsed tunnels, or simply tricks of erosion. Many of them lacked the equipment to investigate further and had to rely on sense alone. They described the desert as if it were holding its breath, as though the land itself had decided to keep its story from unfolding too easily. Today, as modern researchers revisit those same areas, they find that many of the early accounts weren't exaggerations or misunderstandings. They were the first observations of something genuinely hidden beneath the surface. Ground-penetrating scans often confirm structural anomalies where those early explorers had noticed unusual features. This overlap between ancient curiosity and modern tools creates a bridge between eras. It shows that the land has been hinting at its secrets for a long time, waiting for the moment when we'd finally have the ability to see deeper. The desert's ability to preserve is one of its strongest traits. Wood rots in humidity, metal corrodes in moisture, textiles decay in dampness. But the dry environment around the pyramids slows decay to a crawl. Something placed underground here can remain almost unchanged for centuries. That's part of what makes the potential for hidden chambers so intriguing. If something was sealed beneath the surface intentionally, there's a good chance it's still in excellent condition, not because it was protected by human design alone, but because the desert itself became a protective layer, shielding whatever lies underneath from the weathering forces that shape other parts of the world. People sometimes underestimate how much effort went into the ancient construction process. The builders didn't simply place the pyramids on top of the ground. They often carved into the bedrock first, levelling areas, removing large sections of stone, and creating underground spaces that acted as part of the overall structural plan. This means that the desert we see today is partly natural and partly shaped by the hands of people who lived thousands of years ago. The boundary between geology and architecture becomes blurred in ways that make the region feel alive with intention. The land wasn't just chosen, it was studied, adjusted, and prepared with a level of detail many wouldn't expect unless they've stood near those stone blocks and seen how precisely they were placed. The landscape surrounding the pyramids is scattered with evidence of ancient activity. Quarry marks, tool impressions, areas where large blocks were cut and then dragged across smoothed pathways. These features aren't hidden, but they aren't widely noticed either. The desert presents them quietly, letting them rest gently under the sun rather than framing them as obvious signs. If you walk slowly enough, you might see faint lines carved into the ground where sledges once moved. You might find depressions that once held wooden beams used for leverage. These aren't dramatic discoveries on their own, but they show that the area was once alive with movement and planning. And where major activity happened above ground, it's reasonable to think something was happening below as well. The idea of hidden spaces beneath the pyramids gains strength when you understand how the environment responds to time. Sand shifts, but stone remains steady. Layers of sediment build slowly, but carved openings stay consistent. When researchers detect a space underground, they can often tell whether it's natural or man-made by the shape alone. Natural cavities tend to form through erosion, or the movement of groundwater long ago. These create irregular voids, uneven shapes, and rough surfaces that follow geological logic. In contrast, human-made chambers often have straight lines, right angles, and smooth surfaces. Even after thousands of years, those geometric features remain distinct. They stand out clearly in modern scans and give researchers confidence that what they're detecting once served a purpose. There are regions near the pyramids where the ground produces unusual acoustic responses. When tapped or pressed, the vibrations don't match solid stone. They echo slightly, suggesting hollow space beneath the surface. This method isn't new. People have been using sound to locate cavities for generations. But when combined with modern imaging, these older techniques become part of a fuller picture. The desert might appear silent, but it communicates through subtle differences in density and resonance. It doesn't need dramatic gestures to reveal something. It operates slowly, allowing careful observers to notice patterns. Another thing that stands out in the desert is temperature variation. Stone holds heat differently depending on what lies underneath it. Solid ground warms evenly in the sun and cools at a predictable rate. But if there's a cavity beneath the surface, the temperature above it will shift in a slightly different pattern. Using thermal imaging at dawn or dusk, when the ground transitions between warm and cool, researchers can detect anomalies. These show up as areas that heat or cool at a different pace, revealing potential voids. The desert may seem simple at first glance, but its behaviour under sunlight provides a natural tool for locating hidden structures. The presence of these temperature differences supports the idea that more lies beneath the pyramids than we've mapped. Some of these zones appear close to known passages, others seem to extend in directions that haven't been explored physically. The desert doesn't show these details dramatically. They appear quietly on thermal data, as gentle variations rather than sharp edges. But even subtle differences matter when you're trying to understand something as complex as the pyramid foundations. Historical texts also mention underground features. Some writings from early dynasties include references to rooms that are beneath, or chambers under the Great House, or the lower place where records rest. These descriptions are vague and could refer to many things, but when combined with modern evidence they gain new relevance. It suggests that ancient Egyptians themselves recognized the significance of constructing below ground. Below was not just an extension of above, it served its own purpose. Whether ceremonial, practical, or symbolic, it was considered important enough to record, even if the meaning wasn't explained directly. Visitors who stand in the desert today often mention that the ground feels different near certain areas. This isn't something easily measured, but people sense slight changes in firmness underfoot. The desert surface shifts subtly in response to what lies beneath it. If there's a carved chamber, the way sand compacts over that area changes slightly compared to solid bedrock. It's something you notice if you walk slowly and pay close attention, letting your feet sense the ground rather than rushing from one visible landmark to another. The environment communicates in quiet ways, and some of those ways don't require advanced tools, only patient observation. The promise of secrets in the desert comes from this accumulation of indicators. No single detail provides a full answer, but when you take the temperature variations, the acoustic differences, the scanning results, the historical notes, the geological patterns, and the visible signs of ancient activity, the picture becomes clearer. It suggests that the ground beneath the pyramids holds more than just structural supports. It holds design, planning, intention, and possibly unfinished stories that have remained sealed away simply because no one has had a reason to disturb them until now. And as research continues, the desert remains calm. It doesn't hurry to reveal anything. It has waited this long, and it can wait longer. But for those who study it, the anticipation grows, not as a frantic need to uncover everything at once, but as a steady curiosity about what might surface next. The desert gives nothing away through sudden revelations. It offers hints, patterns, and small invitations for deeper study. And with every new scan or survey, the sense that something meaningful lies beneath becomes stronger. When we think about the people who designed the pyramids, it's common to imagine a single figure standing at the top of a sandy rise, pointing toward the horizon with a rolled piece of papyrus in hand. Maybe someone who looked out over the landscape with a certainty that still inspires admiration today. But the truth is, we don't actually know the full story of who planned these structures. The names recorded in ancient texts give us some clues, especially about high officials, overseers, and builders. Yet the individuals who conceived the earliest designs, refined the first plans, and understood the underlying methods well enough to produce something so stable and lasting, remain mostly unknown. Their presence sits in the background of history, an outline rather than a full picture. Over time, researchers have uncovered inscriptions, administrative records, and fragments of documentation that reflect the work of many people involved in the construction process. But those records mostly describe logistics, materials, and workforce organisation. They tell us who moved the stones, who cut them, who managed the labourers, and who recorded daily progress. What they rarely mention is the identity of the thinkers who decided where underground chambers should go, how tunnels should align, or what system should be used to manage stress on the entire structure. These decisions required specialised knowledge that must have existed but wasn't written down in a way that survived. Many civilizations have left behind architectural plans, sketches, or diagrams, but in Egypt's case, papyrus was fragile. Unless it was stored under ideal conditions, it decayed naturally over time. Records that might have described the earlier stages of pyramid design could easily have been lost within a generation or two. The desert preserves many things well, but it does not protect plant-based writing materials unless they're locked away in sealed chambers or dry tombs. As a result, the people responsible for envisioning the overall structure are missing from the archive. What we have instead are clues in the stones themselves, the way the bedrock was cut, the angles used for support, the placement of cavities in relation to load pathways. These are not random choices. They indicate a clear understanding of engineering principles that weren't written down, at least in any form we've found. Those who designed the pyramids had to understand how forces travel through stone. They needed to know how to prevent collapse in underground spaces. They needed awareness of the risks involved in placing heavy blocks above carved areas. This kind of knowledge comes from experience, testing, and long traditions passed from one generation to another. Modern engineers sometimes express surprise at how well the ancient builders understood these structural concerns, not because the creators were somehow superhuman or mystical, but because the level of precision suggests long and careful refinement. The architects didn't simply begin with massive triangular structures. They started with smaller projects, mastabas, and complex burial chambers. Over time, those earlier forms taught them what worked and what didn't. They learned how cracks spread. They learned which stones resisted pressure best. They understood that underground chambers required careful planning to avoid structural weaknesses above them. But even with those earlier experiments in mind, the jump from simple structures to the Great Pyramid represents a level of organisation and design that suggests a highly trained group of planners. These planners must have spent years studying previous constructions, walking through earlier sites, testing stone properties, measuring angles, and adjusting plans. Much of what they knew would have been expressed verbally or demonstrated physically. Skilled workers and architects likely trained through observation and practice rather than written instructions. That means their knowledge lived in people rather than in stored documents. Every large project in history involves people whose names never make it into official records, not because they were unimportant, but because documentation tends to focus on rulers, supervisors, and ceremonial inscriptions. The individuals who produce the actual design work often remain unnamed. Their ideas influenced every decision, but their identities were considered part of the workforce rather than part of the story. When we look at the structures beneath the pyramids, we see more evidence of this quiet expertise. The underground chambers have precise dimensions and intentional layouts. Some extend deep into the bedrock, others lie directly under the main mass of the pyramid, serving purposes that are still debated. Creating these spaces would have required someone who understood how to map underground pathways, how to maintain ventilation during construction, and how to coordinate teams working in near total darkness. The architects had to design not only the structure above ground, but also the methods for constructing what lay beneath. All of this implies roles that went far beyond symbolic or ceremonial responsibilities. In many ancient societies, builders and designers were valued for their skill, but rarely elevated to positions where their names would be preserved. They worked within a system that prioritized the achievements of leadership over personal recognition. Even if one or more individuals were responsible for the primary design work, the culture may not have considered it necessary to record their names. Instead, the focus was on the pharaoh, the workforce, and the final product. That mindset can make it difficult today to reconstruct the full picture of who contributed what. Still, we can infer some things about the people behind the designs. They must have been educated in mathematics, astronomy, and geometry. They needed to understand surveying techniques that allowed precise alignment with cardinal directions. They had to know how to measure distances and calculate slopes using tools available at the time. The instruments they used, plumb bobs, levelling instruments, measuring rods, seem simple today, but their effectiveness depended on the skill of the operator. A tool is only as accurate as the person holding it, and the consistency of the pyramid measurements shows that the individuals responsible were exceptionally disciplined. The design principles seen in the pyramids also reflect a mindset that valued reliability over experimentation. While early structures show signs of trial and error, the Great Pyramid displays a confidence that suggests the architects were building on extensive prior knowledge. They didn't seem uncertain. They built with a steady hand, following methods they trusted. That kind of confidence doesn't emerge suddenly. It grows through repeated practice, shared techniques, and information passed through master-apprentice relationships. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that construction teams live near the site in organised communities. These areas include bakeries, workshops, and living quarters. They're often described as worker villages, but they likely included skilled specialists as well. If the planners were present on site throughout the building process, they would have needed space to work, meet-in areas, and places to store tools. Some of the structures found near the pyramids could have served these functions. Although the written documents haven't survived, the physical environment still reflects a system where planning and coordination were central. One of the most intriguing aspects of the architect's work is the consistency in alignment and orientation. The precision with which the pyramids face true north is particularly impressive, especially considering the tools available. Achieving this alignment would have required careful observation of the night sky, tracking star movements over extended periods, and applying that information to ground measurements. This long-term observation hints at a group of people whose responsibilities extended beyond construction. They were astronomers, surveyors, and planners all at once. In this context, the idea of whispers from the architects isn't a metaphor, but an acknowledgement of subtle clues they left behind. These clues aren't written in language, but embedded in the choices they made. The angle of a descent passage, the length of a horizontal corridor, the position of a chamber, or the shape of a cavity carved in the bedrock. Each detail reflects a decision made by someone who understood the bigger picture. When scientists and engineers study these structures today, they aren't uncovering secrets in the dramatic sense. They're decoding a system of thought preserved in stone. One could imagine someone standing near the construction site thousands of years ago, watching the first blocks being set into place. Maybe they held measuring tools. Maybe they reviewed plans etched into wood or drawn in sand. Maybe they discussed adjustments with colleagues who were equally knowledgeable. Their reputation would have been based on reliability, wisdom, and experience rather than personal fame. These individuals shaped the future without expecting to be remembered by name. As we walk through these possibilities, it becomes easier to understand why the underground spaces matter so much. If the architects invested effort into designing them, it suggests they saw these areas as essential to the overall purpose of the pyramid. Whether that purpose was structural, symbolic, or functional remains uncertain. But the fact that they carved chambers deep beneath the surface shows their thinking extended downward as much as upward. And modern discoveries hint that there may still be spaces unaccounted for, places where their decisions remain preserved in untouched stone. The idea that the architects left behind more than we've found isn't based on speculation. It's supported by scans showing unexplored voids, by measurements that don't fit existing maps, and by the simple acknowledgement that incomplete excavation leaves room for further discovery. Each unexplored cavity is a reminder that their work continues to communicate through physical form rather than through language. When researchers analyse the stone blocks at different layers, they sometimes find variations that point toward intentional reinforcement. This suggests someone understood how weight would transfer through the structure and how to manage potential weaknesses. That individual or group of individuals didn't need advanced mathematics as we think of it today. They needed practical knowledge based on long observation and experience. They likely learned through years of apprenticeship, gradually gaining responsibility, until they became the ones making decisions about underground planning and architectural layout. When you step back and look at the pyramids not as monuments but as problems solved, you begin to appreciate how skilled these planners were. They had to coordinate thousands of workers, manage supply lines, oversee tools and materials, plan seasons of labour, account for weather, and maintain consistency across years of construction. Behind all of this was a strategy built on knowledge the wider world didn't document, leaving behind a quiet legacy. Even though we don't know their names, their decisions continue to influence how we understand history. Their work became part of the foundation that later generations studied, admired, and tried to interpret. Every new scan, excavation, and mapping effort is essentially a conversation with these long-gone planners, revealing little pieces of their thinking. The more we learn about the underground elements, the more we see evidence of minds that worked carefully and deliberately. As more research continues, these subtle echoes from the architects grow stronger, not through words but through structure, alignment, and design decisions preserved through thousands of years. And the desert landscape that surrounds the pyramids continues to hold these details quietly, offering them up slowly to those willing to look closely. Beneath the surface of the pyramids, far away from daylight and wind, there are spaces that have held their shape for thousands of years without being touched. These underground areas, some mapped and others still only suspected, form a part of the pyramids that people rarely picture when thinking about these ancient structures. Most of the focus tends to fall on the massive blocks above ground, the sloping sides, and the bright open landscape. But the world beneath them is just as important, even though it sits in quiet darkness and rarely makes its presence known. These hidden spaces were not accidental cavities or geological quirks. They were carved intentionally, planned with care, and shaped by people who understood the bedrock well enough to manipulate it with consistency and control. Walking into one of the known subterranean corridors, even through modern access points, gives a sense of how different this environment is from the open desert. The temperature drops noticeably. The air feels denser. The sound of footsteps travels differently, absorbing into stone rather than echoing outward. The narrow passageways slope downward at steep angles, showing that the builders were not concerned about ease of movement but precision of placement. These long corridors, carved directly into limestone, lead to chambers with specific dimensions that never appear random. Every measurement shows intention: height, width, depth, angle. Each factor reflects a plan that must have been laid out long before carving began. The existence of these underground spaces has always raised questions. If the pyramids were tombs, why carve chambers beneath the structure instead of placing everything inside the visible layout above ground? Why go through the effort of cutting long shafts into solid rock when constructing rooms inside the pyramid itself would have been less demanding? Even the earliest known builders understood that working underground presented additional challenges: ventilation, lighting, structural stress, removal of debris, and long hours spent in tight, dark spaces. They wouldn't have chosen this approach without a reason. Some explanations rely on symbolism, suggesting the underground chambers represented entry points to a deeper realm or transitions associated with religious beliefs. Others focus on practical needs, such as creating stable foundations or redistributing weight. However, none of these explanations fully addresses the level of detail found in the subterranean rooms. The more researchers study them, the more these areas appear to be part of a broader design approach, not an afterthought or symbolic gesture alone. In some of the known chambers, the walls are smooth despite the limitations of the tools at the time. This smoothness is not decorative but functional, suggesting that the builders wanted surfaces that wouldn't crumble or shed dust onto the floor. The ceilings in certain rooms are carved at deliberate angles to reduce pressure from the stones above, preventing the formation of cracks. The rooms are often placed where the geological layers of the bedrock are strongest, showing that the people who designed them had a thorough understanding of natural stone structure. Interestingly, some chambers appear deliberately unfinished. The rough surfaces and abruptly ending corridors suggest either a sudden change in plan or the possibility that the room served a purpose that didn't require completion. In archaeology, unfinished spaces are often overlooked, but here they gain significance because everything else in the surrounding structure is so precise. The contrast implies decision-making rather than failed attempts. The builders may have reached a certain point, assessed the stone around them, and chosen not to continue for reasons that made sense at the time. Perhaps the rock quality changed beyond that point, or the structural purpose shifted. These decisions add layers to our understanding of how adaptable and observant the builders were. One of the most compelling aspects of these underground features is the fact that many of them extend deeper than expected. Some go far below natural ground level. Others are positioned in ways that don't align neatly with the rest of the pyramid's visible design. This irregularity has intrigued researchers who see it as evidence of a multi-stage planning process. It suggests that the subterranean spaces may predate some of the above-ground construction, or that the builders integrated earlier features into the newer designs. The idea that the site evolved over time is supported by geological studies indicating that certain carved areas show signs of differing tool marks and methods compared to others. The underground environment also presents unique acoustics. When researchers test the sound properties of certain chambers, they find that the way the walls reflect sound differs noticeably depending on their thickness and shape. In some places, sound dampens rapidly. In others, certain frequencies resonate more strongly. These variations were not necessarily intentional, but they show the physical consequences of carving into stone with such accuracy. Some researchers have wondered whether the builders used sound patterns to detect flaws or hollow areas in the rock before continuing construction. Tapping tools or striking the stone might have allowed them to hear subtle differences that indicated whether the bedrock was reliable or needed reinforcement. This approach is consistent with practices used in other ancient cultures where sound served as a basic diagnostic tool. Another interesting aspect is the airflow within these underground spaces. Even though they are sealed chambers in theory, some areas show signs of minimal but measurable air movement. This airflow might be the result of subtle pressure differences caused by temperature changes, cracks in the rock, or connected shafts that haven't yet been fully mapped. The presence of such airflow has inspired speculation that some of these chambers may link to other areas not yet explored or recognised. It raises the possibility that the subterranean layout is more extensive than currently documented. If so, the builders might have intentionally created small openings or channels to regulate pressure or maintain stable conditions underground. One of the reasons the speculation continues is the growing body of scanned data that shows voids beneath the pyramids that haven't been entered physically. These voids don't match the shape of natural caves. They appear rectangular or linear, with defined boundaries. Their presence suggests rooms or passageways that were carved intentionally, but never opened again after construction. The question then becomes why? Why create chambers that are sealed so thoroughly that no later generation accessed them? In last decades, multiple scanning teams have identified these voids, confirming that there are unexplored spaces beneath the ground. But until excavation occurs, their purpose remains unknown. Some researchers propose that the underground chambers might have served practical roles during construction. Perhaps they were used to store tools, supplies, or temporary supports, but the depth and complexity of some of the known spaces make this explanation less likely. The effort required to carve chambers that deep would have exceeded what was necessary for simple storage, especially when easier above-ground options existed. Others suggest that these rooms may have been used in early planning stages, possibly as reference points for alignment. And yet, the precision of the above-ground structure indicates that the builders had multiple, reliable methods for orientation and levelling, making such underground reference rooms less essential than they might seem. A more compelling possibility is that these subterranean areas had long-term significance. Their positioning suggests knowledge of structural stresses within the pyramid. If the builders understood how weight from the upper layers would press downward, they may have carved these chambers to relieve pressure or distribute forces more evenly. Certain chamber shapes could help protect the structure from collapse, acting like internal supports. This theory aligns with the idea that the builders had practical engineering knowledge, yet it doesn't rule out other functions. A space could serve both structural and ceremonial purposes without contradiction. The environment inside these chambers offers conditions that could preserve objects or materials. If something was placed inside them and then sealed, it could remain protected for thousands of years. The desert's dryness, combined with the depth and stability of the rock, would create near-ideal preservation conditions. This realization fuels much of the curiosity surrounding unexplored voids. If something was stored there intentionally, it may still be present. The idea is not tied to dramatic predictions, but to the simple observation that these environments prevent decay. It is entirely reasonable to consider that important items, records, or materials might have been placed in such spaces. When researchers descend into known subterranean rooms, they often observe how the design remains functional after so much time. Drainage pathways direct any moisture away from the central floor. Carved channels along the walls suggest an understanding of how water might seep into the bedrock during rare rainy periods. The builders designed these areas to withstand environmental changes, meaning they considered longevity from the start. This concern for durability strengthens the idea that these chambers were meant to serve a purpose that extended beyond the lifetime of the builders or even the rulers themselves. The lighting conditions underground would have required careful solutions during construction. The workers likely used reflective surfaces, polished stones, or strategically placed lamps to illuminate the corridors. This process was not simple. Without consideration for ventilation, lamps could have consumed available oxygen quickly, so the presence of these chambers also implies that the builders understood airflow management at least at a practical level. Creating environments where people could work safely underground required attention to detail and understanding of how air moves through confined areas. Even tiny details like tool marks on the walls add to our understanding of how the chambers were created. Patterns of chiselling indicate that teams of workers carved the stone in coordinated sections. The angle of the mark shows whether the workers were standing or kneeling, how they held their tools, and how they approached tight spaces. These details reveal a coordinated effort rather than individual improvisation. They show the presence of leadership and planning on a smaller scale, reflecting the larger planning that shaped the entire project. Today, when scientists examine the underground areas, they use technology that captures minute surface details. Laser mapping creates digital models with accuracy down to fractions of a millimeter. These models reveal faint depressions, subtle curves, and structural patterns that can't be seen with the human eye alone. Through this work, researchers have discovered inconsistencies in some of the underground rooms that hint at changes during construction. Perhaps the builders altered their plans due to unexpected rock formations. Perhaps they expanded certain areas or abandoned others due to practical needs. These adjustments indicate a dynamic process rather than a rigid blueprint. The underground corridors also show evidence of intentional straightness. Maintaining a straight descent for dozens of meters inside rock is not easy. The workers had to check alignment repeatedly. They could not rely on sunlight or open horizons. Instead, they used simple but effective methods, like weighted strings, water levels, and carefully measured lengths. The accuracy they achieved reflects patience and a systematic approach. Their work remains aligned today, unaffected by shifting sands or changes in the surface landscape above. As more modern surveys expand the three-dimensional understanding of these structures, new possibilities emerge. In some areas, voids detected by scanning technology appear far larger than any known chamber. Their size and location raise questions about how the builders reached them and what they intended those spaces to be. Researchers have considered whether these voids might connect to each other in a network of subterranean pathways. If so, it would imply that the underground portion of the pyramid complex was far more extensive than currently documented. The possibility of undiscovered passageways isn't based on speculation alone, but on data that consistently shows unexplained gaps in the bedrock. All of these observations point to a more complex design beneath the pyramids than what is visible above. The underground sections reflect the same level of thoughtfulness as the outer structure, suggesting that the planners saw the entire site as a unified system. These hidden chambers are part of a larger story written in stone rather than in words, shaped by people whose skill and intent still influence the way we study ancient construction today. When people look at the pyramids today, the words that often come to mind are massive, ancient, or mysterious. What's less commonly said, but just as accurate, is precise. Precision is the thread that runs through every measurable feature of these structures. The angles, the alignments, the dimensions, the levelling, and the placement of each stone all show evidence of a level of care that doesn't match the simple tools we often picture in the hands of ancient workers. It raises a quiet but persistent question. Who are the individuals responsible for maintaining that precision day after day, year after year? Not the overseers whose names survive on inscriptions, but the engineers whose work ensured that the vision of the architects could exist in physical form without collapsing or drifting from the intended plan. Their names have been lost, but their decisions remain visible in the stones themselves. When you examine the blocks used in the inner chambers or the perfectly straight descending passages, you're not just seeing carved rock. You're seeing the steady hands and careful eyes of people who had mastered their craft so thoroughly that even today their work appears almost unreal in its consistency. Consider the levelling of the pyramid bases. Modern measurements show that the foundation of the Great Pyramid deviates by only a few centimetres across hundreds of meters. Achieving that without advanced instruments suggests a group of engineers who had refined simple tools into extremely reliable systems. They used water trenches to create a level reference line, exploiting the natural horizontal surface that water forms. They used plumb lines weighted by carefully selected stones. They used alignment rods and sighting techniques that required a steady understanding of geometry. But knowing which tools were available is only part of the explanation. The real skill came from using these tools correctly over long distances and complex terrain. This kind of work didn't happen by accident. Someone had to oversee it. Someone had to check each measurement repeatedly. Someone had to train others to use the tools correctly. These individuals didn't leave behind writings describing their methods, but the structures themselves act as the record of their work. Each stone that sits squarely in place is evidence of someone standing there thousands of years ago, adjusting, measuring, correcting, and eventually approving its placement. Their precision becomes even more apparent when you consider the alignment to true north. The deviation is extremely small, far smaller than what most modern workers could achieve without digital equipment. To align such a massive structure so accurately, the engineers would have needed extensive knowledge of the night sky. They would have observed the rotation of certain stars, used them as stable points, and then transferred those observations onto the ground with consistent accuracy. This process would have required coordination over multiple nights, and likely involved more than one person. It hints at a team of individuals who understood astronomy as much as they understood the behaviour of stone. Some of the most impressive examples of precision appear inside the pyramids, rather than outside. The descending passage in the Great Pyramid is straight for more than 100 metres, with a margin of error so small that even a slight miscalculation would have resulted in a noticeable bend. People often imagine that the workers simply followed a chalk line on the floor, but working in bedrock requires more than a line to follow. It requires knowledge of how rock behaves under pressure, how to maintain the angle while carving downward, and how to avoid twisting the passage. Without precise control, the passage would have deviated. The fact that it didn't shows that whoever directed that work understood the geometry and the tools extremely well. The engineers also had to consider the limitations of human labour. Stone cutting is slow and physically demanding. The more precise the measurements needed, the more carefully the workers had to operate. This meant that the engineers oversaw not just the measurements but also the workflow. They would have needed to manage schedules, reduce errors, and solve problems as soon as they appeared. If a block arrived slightly oversized, it had to be corrected. If a wall drifted off alignment, it needed adjustment. They must have maintained quality control in an environment where even small mistakes could accumulate into significant structural issues. The underground passages and chambers show evidence of this same precision. Carving into bedrock isn't like placing stone blocks where imperfections can be corrected by adjusting the block's shape. Once a cut is made into solid rock, it can't be undone. The engineers had to measure carefully before each section was carved, ensuring that the angle and direction remained consistent. Modern scans show that the straightness of these passages remains reliable to a degree that surprises researchers. Even though the workers did not have access to lasers or digital tools, the results they produced align with the accuracy of much later architectural achievements. This level of precision likely came from a combination of experience and technique. The engineers probably learned from earlier structures such as step pyramids and mastabas. Each project would have offered lessons, helping them refine their methods. Over time, they would have developed a set of best practices, passed down through apprenticeship and shared among teams. These individuals worked in a practical environment rather than a theoretical one. They learned through doing, through observing how stone responded to different approaches, and through correcting errors on earlier projects. By the time they began work on the major pyramids, their knowledge was deep enough to produce results that still astonish modern architects. One aspect of their work that often goes unrecognised is the consistency of block shape. Many people assume that the blocks used in the pyramids are roughly cut, but for the inner layers and passages, they are far more uniform than expected. Achieving that uniformity by hand would have required repeated measuring and remeasuring. It suggests a highly organised workflow where each block was shaped according to specifications checked by someone with a clear understanding of the overall design. The engineers would have needed to manage this process, ensuring that the blocks arrived on site with predictable dimensions so that the building process could continue without interruptions. There is also the matter of the joints between blocks. In some areas, the joints are so tight that modern tools struggle to insert even a thin blade between them. This isn't because the blocks were shaved after placement. It's because they were shaped to such accuracy before being moved into position. The engineers had to design a system that allowed for this level of precision while working with manual tools. They had to anticipate how each block would fit into the larger structure and adjust the work accordingly. This kind of attention to detail required patience, planning and skill developed over years of practice. Their work extended beyond shaping blocks. The engineers also had to manage the transportation of stones across distances. They had to estimate how long certain tasks would take, how many workers were needed, and how much material was required. They had to plan routes, coordinate teams, and ensure that supplies arrived at the right time. Without this level of organisation, the construction process would have been chaotic and slow. Instead, the pace appears steady and reliable, suggesting that the engineers work behind the scenes to maintain order. One of the most revealing features is the way the builders dealt with potential problems in the bedrock. When they encountered rock that was weaker than expected, they didn't simply continue carving. They adjusted, they reinforced, they changed direction if needed. In some places, the floor rises slightly to accommodate a shift in geological layers. In others, the walls thickened to support areas where the stone quality dipped. These changes are subtle but intentional. They show that the engineers were constantly evaluating their surroundings and making decisions based on what they observed. This kind of adaptive thinking is one of the strongest indicators of their expertise. The precision found in the pyramids raises the question of how knowledge was stored and shared among these engineers. Without surviving written records, it's difficult to know exactly how they communicated complex instructions. But the results suggest a structured system. Someone was responsible for keeping track of measurements, directing workers, and explaining techniques. Teams must have held meetings, discussed plans, and addressed issues as they arose. The calm, organised nature of the construction process is embedded in the structure itself. You can see it in the straight lines, the even surfaces, and the consistent angles. Some researchers have proposed that the engineers might have used trial structures or small-scale models to test their plans. While there's no direct evidence of such models, the idea fits with the kind of problem-solving required. Building a model allows for testing without risking mistakes on the main structure. Even if the models were made of wood or clay, which would not survive thousands of years, the concept is plausible. It shows the kind of preparation that would align with the precision visible in the final product. The forgotten engineers also had to manage the human side of construction. They worked with large teams that included skilled stonecutters, labourers, transport workers, and supervisors. Coordinating these groups required managing expectations, resolving conflicts, and ensuring clear communication. The engineers had to balance the demands of the design with the capacities of the workers. Their ability to maintain this balance contributed directly to the success of the project. When scanning technology reveals hidden voids beneath the pyramids, engineers today try to interpret their purpose by analysing their shape and location. In doing so, they are essentially trying to think like the ancient engineers. They look at the angles, assess the stress points, and evaluate the design choices. This process emphasises that the ancient builders didn't act randomly. Every underground chamber, every shaft, and every carved pathway reflects the intention of people who understood the consequences of their decisions. As more technology becomes available, researchers continue to uncover details about how the ancient engineers worked. Laser scanning reveals fine irregularities that map out the sequence of carving. Ground-penetrating radar identifies shifts in density that show how workers approach different layers of stone. All of these clues bring modern researchers closer to understanding the methods used thousands of years ago. The more they learn, the more it becomes clear that the engineers had an advanced understanding of structural behaviour long before such concepts were formalised. Even the way the blocks interlock shows mastery. Some stones are shaped with subtle angles that lock them in place, preventing movement over time. These angles are so consistent that they suggest the engineers used templates or specific guidelines to shape each block. This level of uniformity required a system that ensured accuracy across hundreds of workers. It demonstrates a collective discipline directed by individuals who could envision the entire structure clearly from the beginning. With each discovery, the appreciation for these forgotten engineers grows. Their precision was not accidental, not symbolic, and not exaggerated by modern myth. It was real, repeatable, and visible in every measurable aspect of the pyramids. Their work continues to influence how we understand ancient engineering, showing that advanced results can come from simple tools when guided by experienced minds. The idea of a labyrinth beneath the pyramids usually brings to mind the twisting corridors of ancient stories, but the reality is something quieter, more deliberate, and shaped by the steady patience of people who worked in stone with unbroken focus. The underground areas linked to the pyramids are not random caves or natural hollows. They are carved passages, intentional recesses, and geometric shapes cut into the bedrock by individuals who understood the qualities of the limestone well enough to turn the natural subsurface into a functional part of the entire construction. And while they don't match the dramatic images that popular imagination sometimes introduces, they form a network that is far more interesting because it reflects the slow decision-making and careful planning of the builders rather than a chaotic tangle of tunnels. What we know of these underground features comes from a mixture of physical excavation, measured surveys, ancient accounts, and modern scanning. When combined, these sources build a picture of a complex layout that extends far beyond the publicly accessible sections. Some areas have been known for centuries, documented by early explorers who entered the pyramids with limited light and not much safety equipment. Others have been discovered only recently through muon imaging and ground-penetrating radar, revealing voids large enough to stand in, long enough to measure in dozens of meters, and straight enough to suggest human influence rather than geological chance. The ground beneath the pyramids has held its shape for millennia, preserving whatever is carved into it with a reliability that only stable bedrock can offer. The known subterranean areas begin with the long, sloping entrance corridors that descend into the bedrock. These corridors are narrow and angled, showing the difficulty faced by workers who carved them with limited lighting and tools. Each section had to be measured continuously to prevent drift. Even a small shift in direction would have made the corridors misalign with the intended destination. Despite these challenges, the passages maintain impressive straightness. Their walls provide a record of the tools used, the working height of the carvers, and the rate at which material was removed. You can see the steady approach in the repetition of the marks. It's not rushed, it's consistent. Beyond these well-known corridors lie rooms whose functions continue to raise questions. Some appear large enough to support ceremonial activity. Others look more like functional spaces, possibly designed to manage weight distribution or to serve as staging areas during construction. Their ceilings vary from flat to angled, and the angles match structural considerations rather than decorative ones. The deeper the carving goes, the more carefully the workers had to manage the natural layers of the rock. Each layer has different hardness, and working with them required constant attention to avoid creating weak points that could crack under pressure. There are also smaller niches carved into the walls of the passages. These niches have sparked debates among researchers regarding their purpose. Some suggest they were used to hold lamps, helping to illuminate the work areas. Others think they may have served structural purposes or acted as support points for wooden beams during construction. The niches vary in size and placement, hinting that they were adapted to the needs of each specific corridor. They add a level of complexity to the underground layout, showing that the builders didn't simply carve long tunnels without modification. They adjusted continuously based on what they found and what they needed. Farther down, the subterranean areas open into chambers whose dimensions shift dramatically. One room may be broad and low, while the next may be tall with a sharply angled ceiling. This variation isn't decorative. It reflects the engineering needs of the surrounding weight. Some chambers had to be carved with low ceilings to prevent collapse. Others included angled roofs to help redirect pressure. The builders understood how stone reacts to the weight above it. They worked with those forces instead of against them. What makes the underground sections even more intriguing are the areas that remain inaccessible. Scanning reveals their outlines, but physical exploration has not yet reached them. These voids range in size and shape, but many show characteristics consistent with man-made spaces. Their edges are straight, their boundaries are defined. They do not match the irregular shapes of natural caves. These spaces seem to stretch horizontally in some areas, and vertically in others, creating a multi-level arrangement that suggests purposeful design. Some of the voids appear to sit beneath areas where construction above ground is especially heavy, which leads to speculation that they served as structural features to relieve pressure. Others sit near known corridors, raising the possibility that they form part of a connected network. Still others are positioned in places that don't align with the currently mapped features at all. Their presence is one of the strongest indications that the underground layout is far more extensive than the parts that have been physically explored. The concept of a labyrinth doesn't imply twisting confusion here. Instead, it refers to the layered complexity of passages and rooms built over time, integrated into the overall structure, and sometimes sealed intentionally. These sealed spaces introduce another layer of interest. If the builders closed off certain areas, it suggests deliberate choice. They may have used them during construction, and then sealed them after their purpose was fulfilled. They may have placed something inside and then blocked the entrances to protect it. Or they may have intended those chambers for symbolic purposes that required isolation. Examining the sealing methods provides more clues. Some blocked passages use fitted stones that match the precision of above-ground blocks, indicating intentional closure rather than collapse. The positioning of these stones suggests planning. They were placed deep within the structures, making it unlikely that later generations built them. This supports the idea that the original builders created spaces with the intention that future visitors would not access them easily. The presence of these blocked areas raises questions about what might lie behind them. It could be simple empty rooms, or it could be something that had functional value to the original builders. Some theorize the sealed chambers may have contained construction tools or leftover materials. Others think they might have held symbolic items or records. Without direct evidence, it remains unknown. The desert's stability ensures that whatever is sealed within such rooms likely remains in good condition, shielded from moisture and temperature fluctuations. The subterranean layout also includes long horizontal passages that stretch beneath the desert surface, rather than vertically below the pyramid itself. These passages sometimes extend into areas that appear unrelated to the main structure. They may connect to older foundations or earlier constructions that existed before the pyramids were built. The builders may have reused or adapted previous underground features. Such incorporation of earlier work is consistent with what is seen in other parts of ancient Egyptian architecture. The builders often built on top of older structures or repurposed earlier materials. Some underground pathways show signs of multiple phases of construction, with tool marks that differ in size and pattern. This means the site likely developed over extended periods, possibly across generations. Earlier builders may have carved initial chambers, and later groups expanded or modified them. These changes are visible when you compare surface textures and carving directions. In places, the lines run horizontally, indicating a stage of work focused on widening a passage. In others, the lines run at slight upward or downward angles, showing stages when the workers shifted the direction of carving. The deeper parts of the subterranean area remain some of the least understood. These zones appear in scanning results as thick layers of stone interrupted by planned voids. The tight controlled shapes of these voids suggest that the builders had advanced surveying skills, allowing them to position underground chambers precisely without deviating from the intended plan. They also likely use methods for determining underground distances, perhaps involving rope measurements combined with surface markers. The success of these methods is evident in how consistently the underground features match the above-ground alignment. airflow provides another clue to the extent of the subterranean network. Slight pressure changes detected by instruments indicate that some chambers may connect to external surfaces through narrow channels or shafts too small to detect visually. These channels might have been used during construction for ventilation or lighting. If so, they reveal a level of logistical planning that integrates both above and below ground workspaces. Moisture movement also plays a role in understanding these spaces. Although the desert is dry, occasional humidity changes can reveal differences in stone texture. In some chambers, the walls show faint patterns indicating past water flow, possibly from rare rainfall events that seep through microcracks. These patterns help researchers understand how stable certain areas are and how the builders might have adapted to unexpected conditions. The deeper you go in the existing passages, the more the environment shifts. The dryness becomes more noticeable, the temperature stabilizes, the echo of footsteps softens. These changes highlight why underground environments were useful for preservation. If something was placed there intentionally, it could remain virtually unchanged for centuries. This fact makes the presence of sealed areas even more compelling. If the builders wanted something to last, this would have been the best possible place for it. There is also the possibility that the subterranean layout once connected to broader networks. Some ancient texts refer to underground chambers beneath large structures, describing them as places where records or sacred items were kept. These accounts are vague, but when combined with scanning results and excavation reports, they align with the idea that the pyramids were not isolated monuments. They were part of a larger system that included temples, causeways, and potentially linked underground features. To understand the labyrinth fully, researchers map each known feature in digital models. These models show how the tunnels align with the outer structure, how the chambers relate to each other, and where the unexplored voids might connect. Each new scan refines the model, adding details that reveal subtle patterns. In some cases, these patterns suggest symmetry that isn't visible when standing inside the pyramid itself. The symmetry may indicate a deliberate mirrored layout or reflect the builder's desire to maintain structural balance. As more data accumulates, the picture of the underground layout grows more complex. It becomes clear that the builders didn't treat the subterranean areas as secondary. They devoted significant time, effort, and skill to shaping them. Their decisions created a network that is as much a part of the monument as the visible blocks. Each void, passage, and chamber represents an intention that has persisted for thousands of years. Knowing this changes how people view the pyramids. Instead of seeing them as simply large structures rising from the desert, they become multi-layered constructions with depth, complexity, and a level of hidden detail that continues to be uncovered gradually. The ground beneath the sand holds as much history as the stones above it. When people think about the pyramids, they usually picture the ancient Egyptians as the sole architects of everything associated with the site. It's a reasonable assumption, since their inscriptions, their tools, their cultural symbols, and their burial traditions form the foundation of most of what we understand about the structures above ground. But the story becomes more complicated when we look below the surface. Some features in the bedrock and deeper geological layers suggest patterns that predate the periods usually associated with Egypt's Old Kingdom. These patterns don't point to a lost advanced civilization in a dramatic sense, but they do raise questions about the long and layered history of human activity in the region long before the pyramids were built. And studying these older traces reveals a quieter narrative about how land, people, and knowledge can overlap across thousands of years. The desert didn't suddenly become inhabited when the pyramids were constructed. Humans lived in this region long before the dynasties familiar to most people. Their presence was shaped by climate shifts, resource availability, and the slow migration of groups searching for stable environments. At various points in the distant past, the Sahara was greener than it is today, with rivers, lakes, and vegetation providing far more supportive conditions for settlement. Communities moved through this landscape, building temporary structures, carving into stone when needed, and leaving behind marks that the desert later covered as it transformed into the arid environment we see now. These older signs of habitation sometimes appear as subtle depressions in the ground, fragments of stone tools, or worn paths invisible to anyone not looking specifically for them. Once identified, they become clues to the fact that the land had a long history before the monumental structures were built. Some of these clues sit surprisingly close to the areas where later builders carved their underground chambers. Tool marks in the bedrock from earlier periods show differences in technique compared to Old Kingdom methods. The older marks are less precise, less uniform, and shaped by different tool types. They tell us that people were working this stone long before it became integrated into the grander constructions of later eras. In some areas beneath the pyramids, geological studies show that certain cavities appear older than the carved rooms associated with pyramid construction. These cavities may have formed naturally, or may have been shaped slightly by earlier inhabitants. Over long spans of time, natural features often become integrated into human design, adjusted or repurposed. The pyramid builders may have encountered some of these older areas and incorporated them into their planning without leaving explicit documentation about how they understood the earlier features. The presence of older voids doesn't diminish the accomplishments of the pyramid builders, but adds time depth to the site as a whole. Ancient Egypt wasn't the starting point of human settlement in the Nile Valley. The region supported communities for thousands of years before recorded civilization. These earlier groups left behind pottery fragments, hearths, burial sites, and tools that predate pyramids by millennia. When archaeological surveys extend beyond the immediate footprint of the pyramids, they find evidence of these older cultures embedded in the shifting layers of sand and sediment. Some tools belong to pre-agricultural societies, others show early experimentation with stone shaping techniques that later evolved into more advanced craftsmanship. When researchers compare the stoneworking methods of these early societies with the methods used to carve the underground chambers of the pyramids, they can see a progression. Not a sudden leap into impossibly advanced technology, but a steady improvement in understanding stone and how to shape it. This continuity provides context for the skills of the ancient Egyptian builders. They inherited a landscape shaped not only by nature, but by countless generations of people who practiced cutting, shaping, and moving stone long before recorded history began. The marks left by those ancient hands are faint, but they form part of the foundation on which later engineering rested. The idea that older civilizations existed near the pyramid sites isn't a dramatic revelation. It fits naturally with the broader timeline of human presence in the region. But what makes these traces significant is how they interact with the underground layout of the pyramids. In some places, the builders appear to have carved around features that already existed in the bedrock. These older features show signs of erosion inconsistent with the fresher cuts made during the pyramid era. This suggests that when workers descended into the stone to create subterranean chambers, they encountered earlier hollows or pathways that they navigated or filled in as needed. Geologists analysing the layering of the rock note that some deeper cavities show water-worn surfaces. These indicate that they may have formed during wetter climatic periods long before the pyramids were conceived. Early human groups may have used these natural cavities for shelter or storage. By the time the pyramid builders arrived, these spaces may have been partially collapsed or filled with sediment. The builders would have observed the variations in stone density, adjusted their plans, and carved the chambers in directions that avoided unstable areas. Such decisions likely relied on long-standing knowledge passed through generations about how the land behaved. There are also fragments from older settlements discovered near the pyramid plateau. These include grinding stones, fragments of early ceramics, and traces of fire pits. Their locations don't suggest permanent cities but reflect temporary camps or seasonal activity. The presence of these artifacts shows that people were familiar with the area long before it became a monumental landscape. They indicate that knowledge about the region's bedrock, elevation, and natural features may have been passed through generations. Even if this knowledge wasn't formalized, it could have influenced how later builders understood the land. Some researchers have proposed that the choice of the pyramid site was influenced not only by astronomical alignment and access to quarries, but by long-term familiarity with the land. Groups living in the region for thousands of years would have gained insights about which areas were most stable, where bedrock was strongest, and how water moved beneath the surface. These observations accumulate over generations and become part of a cultural memory that influences decisions even when written documentation is absent. The builders may have chosen the pyramid site in part because earlier communities recognized its stable foundation and advantageous position. In certain parts of the underground layout, there are marks that resemble very early stone-cutting techniques, occurring beneath layers carved by Old Kingdom workers. The older marks appear more rounded, possibly the result of older tools made from different materials. These signs hint that earlier groups may have begun carving or shaping areas that were later expanded or redirected by the pyramid builders. The contrast between old and new cuts helps archaeologists map the timeline of activity in the region. It also supports the idea that the pyramid builders were not the first to shape the bedrock in meaningful ways. The concept of older civilizations influencing the pyramid region doesn't imply direct collaboration. It's more like how a modern city rests on layers of earlier settlements. Over thousands of years, places accumulate traces of different cultures. The decisions of later builders are shaped not only by their own knowledge, but by the physical environment created by earlier occupants. If early groups carved into the bedrock to create shelter or store food, those spaces might have prompted later builders to examine the area more carefully, eventually choosing the site for its characteristics. Another factor that hints at older influences is the distribution of stone quarries near the pyramids. Some quarries show signs of use that long predate the dynasties associated with pyramid building. The earliest stoneworking in these quarries was likely done by groups who lived in the region during periods when the climate was more favourable. These early quarrying activities would have left behind partially shaped surfaces, test cuts, and early methods of splitting stone. Later builders would have recognised these locations as good sources of limestone, continuing the work with more advanced tools and techniques. Some archaeological studies also point to traces of early habitation beneath layers of sand that have since shifted dramatically. These earlier sites show fireplaces, tool fragments, and animal remains. Their age suggests that people moved through these regions during seasonal migrations. The older occupation layers sit below the deposits associated with later activity, revealing a long-term pattern of human presence. These layers don't indicate lost civilizations with advanced technology, but reflect the slow accumulation of knowledge as people interacted with the land. The interactions between early inhabitants and the land help explain why certain underground features appear where they do. If earlier groups noticed natural hollows or strong bedrock formations, they may have used those areas for their own purposes. The later builders could have discovered these features and decided to expand, repurpose, or reinforce them. This layered approach is common in ancient construction, where new work builds upon older foundations. The presence of older structures in the region also influences how we interpret the unexplored voids beneath the pyramids. Some of these voids might date to the era of pyramid construction. Others may be older natural cavities or early carved areas that the builders encountered and incorporated into their work. Without access to these voids, it is difficult to determine their age precisely. But scans show differences in tool marks and wall textures that hint at multiple periods of activity. These older signs of habitation give depth to the story of the pyramid site. Instead of imagining the builders arriving at an untouched landscape, it becomes more accurate to picture them walking through a region that had been shaped by millennia of human presence. The land had been observed, tested, and understood by countless unnamed groups. Their knowledge, whether formally recorded or simply internalized over generations, likely shaped the decisions of the pyramid builders in ways we can only infer through the evidence left behind. This doesn't diminish the achievements of the Old Kingdom. If anything, it shows how human history builds on itself. Skills evolve slowly. Understanding deepens over time. Across thousands of years, stoneworking techniques improved, organizational structures developed, and astronomical observations became more precise. The pyramids represent the culmination of these accumulated experiences. They are not the result of a sudden leap in knowledge, but of sustained effort across many generations. As we continue exploring the underground sections and the layers of history they intersect, these older traces provide context that enriches the overall picture. They show that the story of the pyramids is part of a longer human narrative, one that extends backward into periods that left little written documentation but plenty of physical evidence for those who look closely. When looking at the pyramids from a distance, it's easy to describe them as impressive constructions built with determination and strength. But when you examine them more closely, the sense of strength becomes accompanied by a different feeling altogether. There is a quiet complexity built into their design, a kind of structure that doesn't need to announce itself yet becomes obvious once you start focusing on the details. Every angle, every measurement, every alignment, every unseen component below the surface has been shaped by decisions made to keep the structure stable, functional, and enduring. And the more we study these choices, the more we see the presence of what could reasonably be described as silent technology. Not technology in the modern sense of machinery or metal devices, but a collection of practical techniques and applied knowledge that allowed the builders to solve structural problems with consistency and without leaving behind written explanations. This silent technology begins with something as simple as how the stones were shaped. When people imagine ancient stone cutting, they often picture hammers and chisels with workers chipping away until a rough block emerges. But the pyramids require far more precision than rough shaping. The inner blocks, the corner blocks, the casing stones, and the stones used in angled passageways all had to follow exact measurements. Their surfaces needed to be flat enough to align with the blocks next to them, without creating gaps that weakened the structure. And the angles had to match consistently. Achieving this with basic tools suggests that the builders developed methods that took advantage of natural stone behaviour. They understood how limestone fractured. They knew how to apply force at specific points to separate slabs cleanly. They learned how to smooth and adjust surfaces using abrasion, rather than just impact. Even without written records, the results show a sophisticated understanding of problem solving. When the builders shaped stones close to their final size at the quarries, they reduced the weight that needed to be transported. They likely used wooden sledges, but these sledges required surfaces as smooth as possible. Research suggests they may have applied water or other materials to decrease friction. This wasn't machinery in the modern sense, but it was technology rooted in observation. They used the resources available to modify the environment just enough to help with the work. The silent technology becomes more visible when observing the structural engineering inside the pyramids. The Grand Gallery, for instance, is built with corbelled walls, each layer extending slightly inward above the one below it. This shape distributes weight away from the central passage, reducing pressure and preventing collapse. Corbelling is known in many ancient societies, but the consistency with which it appears in the pyramids shows that the builders understood how to control stress within the stone. They didn't simply copy previous structures. They applied principles that worked reliably even when the scale grew significantly. This understanding of stress distribution becomes even clearer when examining the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. These chambers consist of layers of massive granite blocks placed horizontally, with a pointed roof of limestone above the final layer. Their purpose appears simple: redirect pressure and prevent the chamber below from collapsing. But the precision in their arrangement shows long-term testing and knowledge. The builders understood that granite could absorb more pressure than limestone. They understood that layering blocks in a horizontal stack above a chamber would spread the weight more evenly. And they understood that introducing a pointed roof shape would further divert pressure away from the central room. The builders didn't need modern physics to formulate these decisions. They relied on generations of empirical knowledge. They watched how earlier structures failed. They studied where cracks formed and how certain features prevented damage. Over time, these observations turned into consistent methods. The silent technology took the form of predictable results rather than theoretical calculations. Another example appears in the alignment of the pyramids with astronomical markers. The precision of the alignment with true north isn't an accident born of guesswork. The engineers observed the night sky, traced star movements, and used simple tools to transfer those observations into ground measurements. They may have used shadow sticks, water-filled trenches, or sighting rods. These tools were simple, but the way they were used shows sophistication. Aligning such massive structures with this accuracy required repeating measurements multiple times, confirming results over several days, and adjusting as needed. It was a slow process governed not by rush, but by patience and discipline. This kind of silent technology relies heavily on human skill. The tools themselves might seem limited in capability today, but the hands using them made the difference. They practiced the same techniques repeatedly until those techniques became reliable enough to handle complex tasks. Over generations, these practices turned into a system that produced consistent results. That system is still visible today in the uniformity of the blocks, the accuracy of the angles, and the straightness of the underground passages. Inside the pyramids, the narrow shafts that extend from the chambers toward the exterior show another layer of silent technology. These shafts are straight, narrow, and angled with impressive precision. There are still debates about their purpose. Some suggest they aligned with stars, others suggest they served ventilation or symbolic functions. But regardless of purpose, constructing them required knowledge of how to maintain straight lines within solid stone. The builders couldn't simply look through the shaft while carving. They needed to plan ahead, measure the angle carefully, and maintain the direction consistently, even when the shaft was too narrow for a person to enter. They may have used weighted strings or rods to guide the direction. The consistency of each shaft shows that these methods worked reliably. The silent technology becomes even more apparent when studying the subterranean areas. Carving chambers beneath tons of stone required managing stress, airflow, and lighting. The builders would have needed methods for preventing oxygen depletion, controlling dust, and moving debris upward through narrow passages. Some of these methods can be inferred from the physical layout. Carved niches along the walls may have held lamps or supports for ventilation tubes. The presence of certain angled ceilings suggests that the builders observed how stone responded to the weight above and adjusted accordingly. In some underground areas, the floors are carved with channels that may have managed water flow during rare periods of moisture. Understanding how water might enter the stone layers requires observing the environment over long periods. This kind of planning shows that the builders weren't just following a blueprint. They were working with the land, responding to the natural characteristics of the bedrock, and using that understanding to create stable spaces that could survive fluctuations in temperature and humidity. Silent technology also appears in the organization of labor. The builders needed a consistent system for dividing tasks, assigning roles, and ensuring that each stone arrived at the correct location. They had to maintain communication across large areas, coordinate large groups of workers, and track the progress of each stage of construction. Even without modern written documents describing schedules or logs, the physical evidence suggests that the builders operated under a highly structured approach. Worker villages reveal steady food supplies, organized workshops, and standardized tools. These signs suggest a system designed for efficiency, where every person played a role in maintaining the precision of the construction. Some of the most compelling examples of silent technology appear in the joinery of the stone blocks. In certain parts of the pyramids, the blocks fit so tightly that even modern researchers struggle to insert thin tools between them. The builders achieved this level of fit without using metal saws capable of producing smooth surfaces. Instead, they used stone tools, abrasion, sand, and consistent pressure. The angle and shape of each block had to match the surrounding stones precisely. Achieving this across millions of blocks required a system of measurement that worked reliably. That system may not have involved written documentation, but it clearly relied on standardized units, consistent reference points, and skilled workers using proven techniques. The silent technology also extends to the environmental conditions of the site. The builders understood that working in the desert required controlling heat, managing water, and timing activities based on seasonal conditions. They likely planned construction phases around periods when temperatures were more manageable. They transported stones along predictable routes. They used the natural topography of the plateau to steady their work. Each of these choices reflects an understanding of environmental engineering, even if no formal written accounts survive to explain it. In some ways, the silent technology is most obvious in what hasn't happened. Over thousands of years, the pyramids have not collapsed, shifted dramatically, or eroded in ways that compromise their main structure. The interior passages remain stable, the underground chambers retain their shape, the alignments remain accurate. This longevity speaks to decisions made by people who understood how to build for the long term. The builders also applied silent technology in ways that influenced how the pyramids interacted with the natural world. For example, the position of the pyramids relative to each other seems intentional. The distances between them, the angles at which they are placed, and the alignments along the plateau reflect coordination rather than arbitrary placement. This suggests that the builders had a broader understanding of the landscape, not just of individual structures. They may have considered drainage patterns, geological stability, and visual alignment from various vantage points. These considerations form another layer of silent technology, where practical choices produce lasting results, without placing emphasis on symbolic or decorative explanations. When researchers use modern tools to scan the pyramids, they often identify density variations in the stone that hint at hidden features or unexplored voids. These variations don't necessarily indicate dramatic discoveries waiting to be uncovered. Instead, they show how carefully the builders managed stone distribution. They arranged blocks with attention to where strength was needed most. They filled certain areas with smaller stones to reduce weight. They carved deeper where the bedrock allowed and reinforced where it didn't. These decisions suggest an ongoing dialogue between the builders and the environment, where silent technology acted as the language guiding the construction. This silent technology also shaped how the pyramids responded to time. The thermal expansion and contraction of stone, the wind patterns across the plateau, and the occasional moisture changes have not caused catastrophic damage to the structures. This stability reflects an understanding of how stone behaves in the local climate. The builders may not have had modern terminology for thermal stress, but they would have observed how stone expanded and contracted. They learned from earlier constructions how certain shapes cracked more easily than others. They adapted methods accordingly. The silent technology extends beyond the physical aspects and into the conceptual ones as well. The pyramid builders worked with a worldview that saw practical problem solving as a natural extension of daily life. They didn't distinguish between scientific reasoning and craftsmanship. They simply worked with the land, the tools, and the knowledge they had. Their quiet mastery of these skills is still clear in the details of the structures today. And as each new survey, scan, or excavation reveals more about the underground areas and the construction methods, the silent technology becomes a little louder, not because it was meant to be announced, but because observation continues to pull its details forward. When people talk about the pyramids, the conversation often moves toward the theories that surround them. Some theories are grounded in archaeological evidence. Others come from attempts to explain what isn't yet understood. And then there are theories that sit somewhere in the space between, influenced by observations of the stars, the layout of the structures, and the quiet possibility that certain ideas may have influenced the builders, even if there is no direct written record. The pyramids generate this mix of ideas because they are at once familiar and deeply puzzling. They stand in the open desert where anyone can see them, yet the reasoning behind certain choices remains locked inside the stone, leaving a gap that people naturally try to fill. One of the theories that receives regular attention relates to the alignment of the pyramids with the stars. When researchers measure the orientation of the structures, the consistency becomes difficult to ignore. The placement of each pyramid appears intentional in relation to the night sky. particularly to constellations that would have been prominent during the period of construction. The alignment with true north is the most obvious example of this. Achieving such accuracy by hand required steady observation, repeated measurements, and a clear system for transferring celestial points onto the ground. Whether this alignment reflected a practical need, a symbolic belief, or a combination of both, it suggests that the builders understood the relationship between the land and the sky in a practical way. The idea that the pyramids were built according to a pattern influenced by the stars is supported by the consistent orientation of their sides. The builders clearly paid attention to the cardinal directions. They could have aligned the structures in any other direction without impacting the stability, but they chose a layout that reflects broader natural patterns. This decision is what encourages theories involving astronomy. It implies that the builders were observing something beyond the immediate environment. They took the time to track star movement, record the positions over multiple nights, and apply these observations to the construction process. The shafts inside the pyramids add another layer to the discussion. These narrow, angled ducts rise from the internal chambers toward the exterior. Their dimensions are too small for human movement, so they weren't meant as passageways. Their straightness and orientation have led some researchers to consider whether they pointed toward specific stars or constellations. This idea isn't proven, but it's not unreasonable either. If the builders used certain stars to orient the entire structure, it wouldn't be surprising if they also incorporated star-related features inside. The shafts serve as physical evidence for this kind of thinking. They don't confirm the theory outright, but they keep the question open. Another theory looks at the layout of the three largest pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Some have pointed out that their positions resemble the layout of certain stars in Orion's belt. This observation has been debated extensively. Some researchers argue that the similarity is coincidental or overstated. Others believe that the alignment was intentional, forming part of a larger pattern linking the structures to the sky. Whether the resemblance is purposeful or accidental, the fact that the idea persists shows how naturally people look for patterns between the land and the stars. And given the accuracy of the builders' astronomical observations in other areas, it's not unreasonable to wonder if the layout reflects something more than chance. The relationship between stone and starglow, meaning the link between the structures and the sky, remains one of the more persistent themes in theories about the pyramids. It's a theme supported by measurable details rather than speculative leaps. The pyramid's alignment to true north is measurable. The shaft's angles are measurable. The positions of the structures relative to each other are measurable. These measurements form the foundation of theories that involve astronomy, not because the builders had telescopes or advanced mathematical tools, but because they had patience, experience, and a clear interest in the sky. Another category of theories focuses on the purpose behind the subterranean chambers. Some researchers propose that these underground spaces serve symbolic roles related to the earth, the underworld, or other spiritual concepts. Others believe the chambers had structural purposes, acting as pressure relief zones to prevent collapse. And then there are theories that suggest the underground spaces might have been part of ceremonial processes or early planning stages. The truth may include elements from multiple explanations. The lack of inscriptions in the underground chambers adds to the uncertainty. Without written accounts, these spaces become open to interpretation. Theories about hidden rooms beneath the pyramids also stem from modern scanning methods. Muon imaging and ground-penetrating radar have detected voids that do not appear in any existing maps. These voids are significant in size and clearly defined in shape. Their existence invites theories about what they might contain. Some suggest they could be unfinished chambers. Others suggest they may hold objects intentionally placed there by the builders. And some believe these voids might be structural features that help support the weight of the pyramids. None of these theories can be confirmed without direct exploration, so the discussion continues. Another theory that arises from the underground design is the idea that the builders may have used acoustic properties to test the stability of the bedrock. When people tap on stone, the sound it produces can indicate its density and whether any voids exist beneath the surface. Some chambers have acoustic profiles that differ noticeably from others, which suggests that the builders may have used sound to detect cracks or weaknesses. This is not a theory that relies on symbolic interpretation. It comes from practical observation. Workers in many ancient cultures used sound to evaluate stone. It is entirely possible that the pyramid builders did the same, developing methods that allowed them to carve deep underground without risking structural collapse. There are also theories that involve the temperature changes within the pyramids. The interior remains relatively stable compared to the outside environment. This stability has led to suggestions that the builders understood how to use stone to regulate temperature. Whether through accidental discovery or repeated experience, they created environments where objects could be stored safely. These conditions raise the possibility that some underground spaces may have been used to preserve important items. This idea isn't dramatic, but it is practical. The stone chambers would have provided conditions far more stable than any surface structure. The levelling of the pyramid bases has inspired theories as well. The foundations are remarkably flat, achieved through methods that would have required careful measurement. Some researchers believe the builders used water-filled trenches as levelling tools, exploiting the fact that water naturally finds a horizontal surface. This method would have been simple but effective. If the builders used water in this way, it would mean they applied natural principles as practical tools, forming another layer of silent technology. Such an approach fits with many other choices seen throughout the construction. There are also theories that connect the pyramids to earlier structures built in other regions. Some researchers look at similarities in shape, layout, or stoneworking methods, and suggest that knowledge may have been shared across cultures. This doesn't imply that the pyramids were built by people from other regions, but it does suggest that ideas travel. Human groups often adopt techniques they see in neighbouring or predecessor cultures. Theories about shared knowledge are grounded in archaeological evidence that shows how craftsmanship evolves gradually rather than appearing suddenly. Many theories arise because the pyramids contain features that serve more than one purpose. A chamber can be both structural and symbolic. A shaft can be functional and astronomically aligned. A passage can provide access during construction and carry meaning beyond its practical use. This duality makes it difficult to settle on a single explanation. It also opens the door to multiple theories that coexist without contradicting each other too strongly. If the builders used astronomical alignment for practical reasons, that doesn't rule out symbolic interpretation. If underground chambers served structural roles, that doesn't eliminate the possibility that they held cultural significance as well. Some theories speculate about whether certain spaces were intentionally hidden. If the builders sealed rooms or passageways carefully, they must have had a reason. Many sealed areas appear deliberate rather than accidental. The builders used fitted stones to close them, suggesting intentional closure. Theories about hidden objects arise from this observation. These theories don't rely on imagination alone. They come from the physical signs of sealing and the stability of the underground environment. If something was placed in those sealed spaces, it could still be there today. Until exploration reaches those voids, the theories remain open. Measurement-based theories also appear when researchers examine the proportions of the pyramids. Some note that the ratio of height to base length approximates certain mathematical constants. Whether this was intentional or coincidental remains a point of discussion. The builders didn't leave behind mathematical texts explaining their reasoning, so we can't know if they pursued specific ratios, but the consistency of their measurements suggests they followed a system that produced predictable results. Their methods may have naturally led to proportions that modern researchers recognize as mathematical patterns. In recent years, new theories have emerged from digital modelling. When researchers input the exact measurements of the pyramids into simulation software, certain patterns appear. These patterns relate to stress distribution, airflow behaviour, and thermal stability. The simulations show that decisions made by the builders had long-lasting effects on structural integrity. These observations support theories about deliberate engineering choices. The builders may not have used advanced formulas, but they clearly understood how to build structures that could withstand environmental challenges. These digital insights do not answer every question, but they reinforce the idea that many decisions were grounded in practical knowledge. Within the broader landscape of theories, some focus on how the pyramids relate to their surrounding structures. The placement of temples, causeways, and satellite pyramids forms a pattern that suggests coordination rather than random arrangement. Theories about ritual pathways, astronomical sight lines, or symbolic landscapes emerge from these observations. Whether the builders intended these patterns for symbolic reasons or practical ones remains debated. But the physical arrangement supports the idea that the pyramids were part of a larger complex designed with careful consideration of spatial relationships. There are also theories related to how the builders managed such a large workforce. Some suggest they used hierarchical teams with clear responsibilities. Others suggest rotational labour, where workers participated for parts of the year. These theories are based on evidence from worker villages, tool remains, and inscriptions found nearby. They show how the engineering precision seen in the stones reflects an equally organised human system. Theories about labour organisation help fill in the human side of the construction, showing that even silent technology required structured cooperation. Another group of theories considers whether the pyramids served multiple purposes simultaneously. They may have been monuments, burial structures, engineering exercises, and astronomical markers. The evidence suggests they were not single-purpose structures. They represent a combination of practical and symbolic intentions. Theories that expand into this territory don't seek to elevate the pyramids into mysterious creations, but to acknowledge their complexity. The builders lived in a world where practical decisions and symbolic meanings often overlapped. As the discussion unfolds through different theories, the consistent theme is that the pyramids are products of accumulated knowledge. Each theory reveals something about the builder's environment, tools, observations, or motivations. The theories persist because the structures contain more information than current methods can fully decode. Some details remain buried in the stone. Others are tied to the sky and the patterns the builders observed at night. For now, the dialogue between what is known and what remains uncertain continues, supported by every measurement, scan, excavation, and comparative study. When studying the pyramids, it becomes clear that the structures themselves hold only part of the information needed to understand how they were built and why certain choices were made. The rest of the details are locked in the land, buried in rock layers, sediment deposits, changes in soil composition, and subtle geological features that took shape long before and long after the construction. The Earth preserves information in ways that don't depend on writing or symbolic representation. Its layers act like pages, each recording events through physical changes. The surface carries marks from ancient settlements, shifts in climate and human activity, and beneath the pyramids, the ground holds clues about how long people worked in the area, how they adapted to environmental changes, and what geological features influenced the placement of the structures. Understanding the pyramids isn't only a matter of looking at the stones. It requires studying the landscape around them, the ground beneath them, and the soil patterns that stretch outward in all directions. These natural records create an archive that goes back far earlier than any written inscription. When researchers dig below the surface in controlled excavations, they can see the layers of sand, silt, rock, and sediment. Each layer forms a timeline. The deeper the layer, the older the event recorded in it. By comparing these layers with known historical timelines, archaeologists can understand how the environment changed before the pyramids were built. They can identify older human activity and determine how the land's characteristics might have shaped decisions made by the builders. One of the clearest signs of this ancient archive appears in the geological stability of the pyramid plateau. The bedrock beneath the pyramids is unusually firm compared to surrounding regions. This stability would have been noticeable to anyone who lived or worked in the area over long periods. Early groups likely recognised that the ground in this region didn't shift as easily, didn't flood as often, and didn't collapse under weight. These observations would have been passed through generations. Even if the early inhabitants didn't use the land for construction on the scale later achieved, they would have known which areas were reliable. Over thousands of years, such knowledge becomes part of cultural memory. When the pyramid builders began selecting sites, they likely relied on this long-standing familiarity with the land. In many areas near the pyramids, layers of ancient settlement remain beneath the sand. These layers usually contain pottery fragments, stone tools, and traces of temporary habitation. By studying their distribution, researchers can map where ancient people lived, travelled, and worked. The patterns reveal that human presence near the pyramid site extends back far before the structures were built. This doesn't indicate an ancient civilization building unknown megastructures. It simply shows a long history of people interacting with the environment. The earth records their presence in ways that writing never could. Each broken pot, each worn tool, and each footprint preserved in hardened sediment adds to the understanding of how the land was used through time. The archive extends deeper than cultural remains. The rock layers themselves reveal the environmental conditions of distant eras. For example, certain minerals within the layers indicate periods when the region had more moisture. These wetter eras correspond with times when vegetation was more abundant, rivers flowed more steadily, and the climate supported more wildlife. Early human groups likely took advantage of these conditions, settling in areas that would later become desert. As climate shifted toward aridity, the land changed gradually, forcing people to adjust their behaviour. These adjustments shaped where people moved and how they used natural resources. In this way, environmental history becomes intertwined with human history, and the Earth holds records of both. The geological archive beneath the pyramids also includes signs of natural cavities that formed without human intervention. These cavities developed during wetter periods when water seeped through the stone and slowly dissolved certain minerals. When the climate dried, these cavities remained, forming empty spaces within the bedrock. Later, builders may have encountered these cavities during construction. They may have used them, avoided them, or filled them depending on their size and shape. Identifying which cavities are natural and which were carved requires careful analysis of the stone surfaces. Natural cavities show irregular patterns formed by water. Human-carved areas show tool marks, smooth surfaces, and straight lines. The earth provides the context that helps distinguish between the two. One of the most important aspects of treating the earth as an archive is understanding that it holds information even when it doesn't look connected to human activity. For example, changes in sediment colour can indicate the presence of organic material. The presence of certain minerals can show whether water flowed through an area long ago. Soil compaction levels can reveal whether the land once supported heavy structures or repeated foot traffic. These details allow researchers to reconstruct a timeline of events with surprising accuracy. The ground beneath the pyramids may look like a solid foundation, but it contains countless small indicators of what happened there before, during, and after construction. In some areas near the pyramids, soil samples show evidence of ancient quarrying activity. These samples include fragments of limestone debris, scratches from stone tools, and traces of burned material likely associated with heating stone to make it easier to cut. These remnants lie below layers of later sand deposits, meaning that quarrying happened long before the surface looked as it does today. By analysing the distribution of these remnants, researchers can estimate how long quarrying occurred and whether the activity preceded the pyramid construction or occurred alongside it. This information is part of the Earth's archive, revealing human behaviour through physical evidence rather than written records. The Earth also records the movement of people through ancient pathways. These pathways aren't visible on the surface anymore, but their traces remain beneath the sand. Repeated foot traffic compacts the soil in subtle ways. Over time, compacted soil becomes denser than surrounding areas. When researchers examine soil density maps, they can identify these ancient routes. Some of the pathways near the pyramids run toward known quarries, others lead to the Nile, still others head toward older settlements. These paths form part of the broader landscape that supported pyramid construction. They show how people moved materials and resources long before modern roads existed. When studying the Pyramid Plateau, researchers also find evidence of ancient water movement. Although the region is dry today, the Earth records periods when water was more present. Certain depressions in the bedrock show smoothing caused by slow-moving water. Sediment layers reveal the presence of ancient river channels. Some channels run through areas that later became the foundation for pyramid complexes. Knowing where water once flowed helps explain why certain parts of the plateau were avoided during construction. It also clarifies how workers may have transported materials during wetter periods. Water movement shapes the landscape, and when it recedes, the marks remain in the geological record. Another significant part of the Earth's archive comes from the mineral composition of the bedrock. Different layers contain different types of limestone with varying hardness. When researchers map these layers, they find that the builders chose areas where the limestone was particularly strong. This choice wasn't accidental. The builders would have noticed the difference in stone quality when carving test cuts or quarrying blocks. Over time, this knowledge would have grown, guiding future construction decisions. By studying the distribution of stone types, researchers can understand how the builders adapted to the geological conditions. The Earth's archive shows that they did not build blindly. They worked with the land's natural strengths. The archive also includes information about environmental events that occurred during or shortly after the construction periods. For example, layers of sand containing fine dust from distant regions can indicate major wind events. Deposits of silt can indicate flooding episodes. When these layers appear directly above construction debris, researchers know that these events occurred during or immediately after the building activity. This context helps establish timelines. It also demonstrates how the environment interacted with human projects. The builders worked within conditions that changed over time, and the Earth recorded those changes layer by layer. One of the most intriguing aspects of treating the Earth as an archive is how it reveals the long-term interaction between natural processes and human activity. For instance, certain layers show signs of controlled fire. These could be related to quarrying or pottery production. Others show signs of plant growth, indicating periods when vegetation was more abundant. When these layers lie beneath or around construction zones, they reveal how people adapted to changing environmental conditions. They also show that human activity didn't occur in isolation. It coexisted with natural processes, and the Earth stored evidence of both. The archive extends beyond the pyramids themselves. Nearby structures, such as temples and causeways, also rest on layers of older activity. By studying the soil beneath these structures, researchers can understand how the entire pyramid complex evolved over time. Some areas show signs of repeated construction and reconstruction. Others show long periods of stability. The Earth's record reveals patterns of use that written documents don't always describe. It shows where people walked, where they paused, where they worked, and where they built. When researchers analyze core samples taken from deep beneath the pyramid plateau, they find layers that go back far beyond human occupation. These layers provide context for how the land formed naturally. Understanding this geological history helps explain why certain areas were chosen for construction. It also reveals how ancient climate shifts influenced human settlement. The deeper the sample goes, the more it shows about the long-term evolution of the region. These findings remind us that the story of the pyramids doesn't begin with the builders. It begins with the land itself. In some cases, the archive reveals clues that align with the subterranean spaces beneath the pyramids. The distribution of natural cavities helps explain why certain chambers take the shapes they do. The hardness of certain rock layers explains why some tunnels angle upward or downward. The presence of ancient sediment pockets shows why some corridors deviate slightly from a straight path. The Earth's archive provides the reasoning behind choices that the builders didn't record in writing. It explains the practical side of their design decisions. The idea of the Earth as an archive doesn't imply the presence of hidden messages or encoded information. It simply means that the physical environment contains a record of everything that has happened to it. Every shift in climate, every period of human activity, every natural process leaves a trace. When these traces are studied together, they form a narrative. Not a narrative shaped by symbolism or interpretation, but one based on physical evidence. The Earth retains this evidence long after written records fade or disappear. In places like the Pyramid Plateau, where conditions are unusually dry and stable, the archive remains well preserved. As researchers continue to study the underground structures, the surface remains, and the deeper geological layers, the archive grows clearer. It reveals a landscape shaped over thousands of years by both natural forces and human choices, and it shows how the pyramids fit into this larger picture. They are not isolated monuments placed randomly in the desert. They are structures built on land shaped by long-term patterns of climate, geology, and human presence. The Earth holds the information needed to understand these patterns, even when the written record falls short. As researchers continue piecing together information from the land, the stone, the underground networks, and the broader archaeological context, they often come across discoveries that disrupt assumptions held for decades. These discoveries don't usually arrive with dramatic announcements or sudden revelations. They appear quietly in survey results, excavation reports, and scanned images that reveal something unexpected. Over time, as more data is collected and compared, these small findings begin reshaping the way the entire story is understood. The pyramids have been studied for centuries, but they continue to produce information that shifts the narrative, sometimes in subtle ways, and sometimes in ways that prompt re-evaluation of long-accepted ideas. One of the most significant recent contributions to this shift comes from advanced scanning methods. When muon imaging first detected an unexplored void inside the Great Pyramid, it surprised many researchers who assumed the structure was fully mapped. The existence of a large unmapped space indicated that our understanding of the interior layout was incomplete. The void's shape suggested more than just a random gap. It had defined boundaries, a consistent outline, and the appearance of something intentionally built. This discovery didn't reveal what the space contained or why it was constructed, but it demonstrated that the pyramid's interior still held features unknown, even after centuries of study. It showed that assumptions about the completeness of earlier explorations needed to be revisited. Ground-penetrating radar has also contributed to the emerging picture. As researchers scanned areas around and beneath the pyramids, they found density changes that hinted at features buried deeper than previously mapped. These features included linear shapes consistent with corridors, rectangular outlines resembling chambers, and density shifts that suggested filled or empty spaces within the bedrock. While not all these anomalies represent actual structures, their presence raises questions. Some may turn out to be natural formations, others may reveal construction stages or planning decisions that are not fully understood. Each new scan invites further investigation and refines the understanding of how extensive the underground layout might be. Even small discoveries can shift perspectives. For example, detailed analysis of tool marks in certain subterranean areas shows differences in technique between sections. These differences indicate that work was carried out in phases or by groups using slightly different methods. When these variations are mapped, they reveal patterns of construction that don't always align with earlier assumptions. Instead of a single, uninterrupted building process, the evidence suggests periods of adjustment, redirection, or re-evaluation. This doesn't diminish the builder's abilities, it simply shows that large projects naturally evolve, responding to conditions encountered during construction. Understanding this gradual evolution helps researchers create more accurate models of how the pyramids were built. Another area reshaping the story involves discoveries connected to the broader landscape. Excavations around the Pyramid Plateau have revealed structures, workshops, roads, and storage areas that expand the picture of what life was like during the construction period. Worker towns show signs of organised labour, regular food distribution, and tool production. These details help establish a clearer understanding of how such a large workforce was managed. They also correct earlier misconceptions. For many years, people assumed the pyramids were built by forced labour or enslaved groups. Archaeological evidence from worker villages suggests a different story. The workers appear to have been skilled labourers who lived in organised communities and received steady supplies. This discovery reshapes the narrative of pyramid construction into one based on coordinated human effort rather than coercion. Another important shift comes from geological studies revealing the long-term environmental changes around the pyramid plateau. By looking at sediment layers, pollen remains, and traces of ancient vegetation, researchers can determine the environmental conditions during different periods. These studies show that the climate during the earliest pyramid constructions was slightly different from today. The Nile's branches may have reached closer to the site. Seasonal flooding may have influenced how materials were transported. If water once reached areas now dry, it would explain how heavy stones could be moved with less effort. These details provide practical explanations for logistics, without relying on assumptions about unknown technologies. The Earth's Archive continues to revise the story by showing how environmental conditions shaped construction methods. The discovery of ancient harbour structures near the pyramids also reshapes the understanding of transport. These harbour remains suggest that boats were used more extensively in construction than previously thought. Large limestone blocks may have been floated along canals or natural waterways before reaching the plateau. This finding adds a layer of efficiency to the methods used by the builders, showing that they understood how to use natural water routes to their advantage. It also helps explain how materials from distant quarries could be transported without overwhelming labour requirements. Discovering these harbour structures demonstrates how much the surrounding land contributed to the success of the pyramids, reinforcing the idea that the site was deeply integrated with the environment. At times, discoveries emerge from detailed measurements rather than dramatic revelations. When researchers remeasure the pyramid's dimensions with modern equipment, they sometimes notice slight discrepancies compared to earlier surveys. These discrepancies might be a few centimetres in height, angle, or baseline length. While these variations seem small, they can help refine construction models. Differences between early and modern surveys can come from erosion, stone loss, or earlier measurement inaccuracies. Updating the measurements helps researchers understand how the structure has changed over time and how the builders originally intended it to be. Inscriptions found in nearby stone quarries have also added information. Some inscriptions describe work crews, their supervisors, and the tasks they completed. These inscriptions match the names found in worker villages, reinforcing the idea of organised teams. They also indicate that different groups worked on different parts of the structure simultaneously. This helps explain how such a massive project could be completed within a relatively short time frame. Instead of one group working from bottom to top, multiple teams worked in coordinated phases, reducing the overall construction time. This discovery reshapes earlier assumptions that the builders relied on a sequential building approach, showing instead a system based on parallel labour. Recent studies involving microscopic analysis of stone surfaces have revealed details about how the builders shaped limestone and granite. Tiny grooves, abrasion patterns, and mineral residues provide insight into the tools used. These patterns show consistent techniques, reinforcing the idea of a standardized system rather than improvised methods. When researchers compare these microscopic results to similar patterns in other ancient structures, they can trace the evolution of stoneworking skill. These discoveries reshape understanding by offering more precise evidence about the builder's techniques instead of leaving the subject open to speculation. One of the most promising areas of discovery involves digital reconstruction. By combining data from scans, measurements, excavation reports, and geological surveys, researchers can build three-dimensional models of the pyramids and the underground features. These models make it easier to test theories. For example, researchers can simulate how weight moves through the structure, or how airflow behaves in the underground chambers. These digital tests reveal patterns that physical investigation cannot always capture. When a digital simulation shows that a certain chamber shape reduces structural stress, it helps confirm that the builders may have designed that shape intentionally. The more accurate these models become, the more they reshape the understanding of how the builders approached problem solving. Another emerging discovery involves the detection of ancient tool fragments embedded in stone. When workers carved through limestone, tiny pieces of their copper or stone tools sometimes remained inside the walls. These fragments can be analysed to determine composition, tool type, and wear patterns. This information provides clues about the materials used, how often tools were replaced, and how builders approached carving different types of stone. Such discoveries help reconstruct the daily practices of the workers, offering a more detailed view of how construction progressed. Some discoveries come from re-examining older excavations with modern techniques. Archaeologists often revisit sites explored decades earlier, but using more precise tools. These new approaches sometimes reveal details overlooked in earlier work. For example, ground samples taken near the base of a pyramid might reveal traces of plant fibers or animal residues, suggesting material used to move heavy stones. A closer look at stone blocks might reveal faint tool marks invisible to the naked eye. These incremental findings accumulate, gradually shifting the narrative toward one that recognizes the builder's resourcefulness and the sophistication of their methods. Even the rhythm of construction becomes clearer through new discoveries. By analysing carbon samples from mortar and comparing them with dated materials from nearby sites, researchers can estimate when specific construction phases occurred. This helps map out a timeline showing how fast different sections were built. The results suggest that the builders worked more efficiently than earlier estimates indicated. They may have timed their work to coincide with periods of lower water levels or cooler temperatures, taking advantage of seasonal changes. The discovery of these patterns reshapes the understanding of how planning and environmental awareness influence the construction process. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence that some underground areas were modified after the main construction was finished. Tool marks in certain chambers appear newer than those in adjacent sections. This suggests that the builders revisited specific spaces to reinforce them or adjust their design. Such changes indicate that the builders continued monitoring the structure even after the main building phase. This discovery reshapes earlier assumptions that the underground layout was completed in a single stage. Instead, it reveals a process where builders observed how the structure behaved and made adjustments as needed. Another category of discoveries involves ceramics and small artifacts found in unexpected locations deep within the pyramid complex. These objects likely belong to workers who spent long hours underground. The artifacts provide insight into daily habits, showing that workers often carried simple tools, small containers, and personal items. While these objects are modest, they humanize the construction process. They show that the underground work was not solely technical. It was carried out by people who spent significant portions of their lives in those spaces. Each discovery adds detail to a story that once seemed distant and impersonal. Discoveries also emerge from comparing the pyramids to structures built in later periods. When researchers analyze buildings from other dynasties, they sometimes see methods similar to those used in pyramid construction. This continuity suggests that the techniques developed during pyramid building influenced architectural practices for centuries. Understanding this connection reshapes the broader narrative of Egyptian architecture, showing that the pyramids were not isolated achievements. They were part of a long tradition of structural experimentation and refinement. At the same time, comparative studies with structures from other regions offer opportunities for new discoveries. When similarities in construction methods appear across different cultures, researchers explore whether these techniques developed independently or through shared influence. Such comparisons don't imply direct contact or grand theories about lost civilizations. They simply show that people facing similar problems often find similar solutions. Discovering these parallels reshapes how we understand the universality of human ingenuity. One of the more subtle discoveries involves how light behaves in certain interior spaces. Researchers have observed that narrow shafts, angled ceilings, and smooth surfaces reflect light in specific ways. These patterns may have helped workers illuminate certain areas more efficiently during construction. The discovery reshapes assumptions about how the builders worked in low-light environments. It suggests they understood how to use surface shape and material texture to carry light deeper into interior spaces. Even the tools used to survey the land before construction have influenced new discoveries. By studying ancient plumb lines, levelling instruments and measurement rods, researchers gain insight into how the builders achieved such precision. Reconstructions of these tools show that they could have produced far more accurate results than earlier assumptions allowed. This discovery reshapes the understanding of the builders' capabilities, showing that their tools were not crude but refined instruments crafted for reliable performance. Every discovery, whether large or small, contributes to a gradual reshaping of the story. The narrative becomes more detailed, more grounded in evidence, and more reflective of the builder's skills. Instead of attributing the pyramids to extraordinary external influences, the story increasingly reflects human effort, practical problem-solving, and an understanding of the environment. Each new piece of information clarifies how the builders approach challenges and how they combine tradition, observation, and adaptation to create structures that continue to endure. As these discoveries accumulate, they shift not only the understanding of the pyramids, but also the broader picture of human history. They show that advanced results can emerge from patience, skill, and collective knowledge. And they remind us that the story of the pyramids is still unfolding. The Earth holds more information, the underground spaces hold more clues, the stones themselves continue to reveal details through close examination. As the story reaches this quieter point, the pace naturally slows, not because anything has ended, but because the movement of the ideas has settled into a calmer rhythm. The focus shifts away from the underground corridors, the stone surfaces, the measurements, the quarries, and the discoveries, and towards something much softer. The pyramids stop feeling like puzzles demanding solutions, and instead feel like long-standing parts of the world that have watched human history unfold. When thinking about them at this slower pace, they take on a different presence. Not mysterious in a dramatic way, but steady in a way that encourages the mind to rest while still remaining curious. They have been here through climate changes, shifting sands, countless generations, and the gradual unfolding of knowledge. And right now, they serve simply as a place to rest your thoughts. When looking back at everything that came before, the underground chambers, the hidden features, the silent technology, the environmental layers, and the small discoveries that continue shaping the story, it becomes clear that the pyramids do not exist in isolation. They're connected to everything around them. They're connected to the land that holds them firmly in place. They're connected to the workers who shaped them stone by stone. They're connected to the distant civilizations that lived in the region long before their foundations were carved. And they are connected to the ongoing work of researchers who continue uncovering new details every year. At this quiet point in the narration, the connections start to settle into a broad sense of continuity rather than separate pieces of information. Sitting with that continuity brings out something that can be hard to notice during the earlier parts of the story. Most discoveries, whether they come from deep underground, from the surface, from the sky, or from digital modelling, do not rewrite human history in dramatic bursts. They reshape it gradually, almost quietly. They fill in places that were once blank. They adjust perspectives. They reveal something that was always there but not yet seen. When these shifts are looked at together, they create a sense that human history is not rigid. It grows as more information is uncovered, and the pyramids play a large role in that growth. They act like markers that help align ideas, evidence, and timelines. Thinking about this process in a dark room or at the end of a long day has a surprisingly calming effect. The sound of information moving slowly and steadily through the centuries has its own kind of rhythm, one that supports rest rather than tension. The pyramids do not hurry anyone. Their presence encourages the mind to slow down, the same way a quiet desert evening encourages stillness. Even imagining walking near their base with sand shifting lightly underfoot and the large stone surfaces towering above creates a kind of grounded sensation. Not symbolic, not dramatic, but steady. The kind of steadiness that makes it easier to drift into a softer state of mind. When exploring the idea of the Earth as an archive and how discoveries consistently reshape the story, it becomes easier to understand why certain uncertainties remain. Some areas beneath the pyramids are still inaccessible, some voids remain unexplored, some tool marks are too worn to interpret clearly, some geological features can be explained in multiple ways. The absence of final answers does not reduce the complexity of the structures. Instead, it gives permission to relax into uncertainty. Knowing that more remains to be discovered creates space to let the mind slow down, because the pressure to reach a conclusion disappears. The pyramids have been standing for thousands of years, and they will continue standing regardless of whether every detail is understood. The calmness that grows from this idea supports a different way of thinking about history. Instead of trying to understand everything at once, the mind can drift into the wider perspective that comes with allowing the unknown to exist without urgency. This approach mirrors how archaeologists often work. They gather information slowly, they test one idea against another, they accept that some questions will not have answers right away. When this slow process is translated into the rhythm of a late-night narration, it encourages rest. The mind doesn't need to reach the end of anything, it can simply settle into the gentle movement of the facts as they arrange themselves over time. When picturing the underground spaces again from this more relaxed point of view, they feel different. Instead of imagining dark corridors full of unknown features, the mind starts picturing stable stone walls carved with intention. The chambers become quiet rooms where workers once moved carefully, shaping surfaces with consistent effort. The air becomes still and cool, the stone becomes solid and reliable, the narrow passages become pathways carved through the earth with patience and method. These images soften the earlier curiosity, replacing it with a grounded feeling of stability. Above ground, the desert environment creates another layer of calm. During the day, the heat radiates gently across the plateau. At night, the temperature drops and the sand cools. The sky becomes clear, and the stars appear sharp against the darkness. Imagining this transition while lying in bed makes it easier for the mind to loosen its grip on the questions and shift toward the steady quiet of nighttime. The pyramids seem different under starlight, less like historical structures and more like parts of the landscape. They blend into the surroundings, shaped not only by human hands, but by the long passage of time. Thinking about the builders at this slow pace also creates a sense of closeness rather than distance. They were people who lived their daily lives with routines shaped by the land. They ate meals prepared by cooks in workers' villages. They carried tools that wore down with use. They walked long paths between quarries and construction sites. They talked to each other during work, made adjustments as needed, and continued shaping the stones one cut at a time. Imagining the human side of the construction helps dissolve any feeling of mystery that might create tension. It becomes a story of gradual work rather than sudden revelation. This human scale brings the narrative back to something familiar and restful. When the mind follows their movements in the quiet atmosphere of a bedtime setting, it glides through scenes that feel steady and grounded. Workers lowering stone blocks into place, teams carving the underground chambers with careful coordination, supervisors checking angles with simple tools, groups shaping limestone near the quarries. This steady motion becomes repetitive in a comforting way, almost like the steady movement of waves or the predictable rhythm of breathing. It makes the story easier to drift along without trying to follow every detail. As new discoveries shift the understanding of the pyramids, they also reinforce this sense of slow unfolding. The story continues changing not through dramatic twists, but through quiet accumulation of details. A new scan reveals a void. A new excavation confirms a building technique. A new geological survey explains why the builders chose a specific location. A new analysis of tool marks shows another layer of skill. These pieces come together gradually, forming a picture that never closes fully, but becomes clearer over time. When looked at from the calm state of late-night listening, this process feels soothing. There is no rush to finish anything. The discoveries will continue long after the narration ends, and the listener can drift into sleep knowing the story is ongoing. Another aspect that becomes calming at this stage is recognizing how long the pyramids have existed in relation to the rest of human history. They stood before paper was common, before most written languages developed into stable forms, before many of the world's familiar cultures emerged. They remained present through periods of growth, conflict, trade, migration, and discovery. This long presence turns them into something steady and reliable. Thinking about something that has remained unchanged for thousands of years creates a sense of stability that supports relaxation. While everything else in the world has shifted countless times, the pyramids have remained anchored to the earth, weathering each change without moving. Imagining lying beside them at night makes this feeling even stronger. The ground would be cool. The sand would shift gently. The stone walls would rise above with silent weight. The stars would hang overhead in a clear sky. The silence would be deep but comforting. In that setting, it becomes easy to let the mind slow down. The steady presence of the pyramids encourages the shoulders to relax, the breathing to deepen, and the thoughts to loosen into softer, slower patterns. When reflecting on how new discoveries reshape our story, it also becomes clear that not every discovery leads to a new question. Some discoveries simply confirm that earlier assumptions were correct. These moments reinforce the idea that the people who built the pyramids understood more about their environment and their tools than they are often credited for. These confirmations reduce unnecessary speculation and allow the mind to settle into a clearer view of the builders as capable, skilled, and grounded in practical knowledge. This shift in perspective adds another layer of calm, because it removes the sense of suspense that sometimes arises from unanswered questions. The idea that the pyramids still hold more information does not create tension when approached gently. It creates openness. The listener can rest knowing that the story is still unfolding, but without needing to hear every detail tonight. The mind can let the unfinished parts drift into the background, the same way distant sounds fade as sleep approaches. The story becomes a setting rather than a puzzle. The pyramids become part of the landscape of thought rather than something needing immediate resolution. As the narration draws closer to a natural resting point, the details of the construction, the underground chambers, the geological layers, the methodical work, and the slow accumulation of discoveries begin forming a wide, calm picture. The edges of that picture soften the longer the listener rests with it. The pyramids are there, steady and quiet. The desert is there, cool and open. The sky is there, stretching overhead without urgency. The builders are there, working carefully in scenes that no longer need close attention. The researchers are there, making slow progress without rushing. And the listener is there as well, at the edge of all this information, free to drift at whatever pace feels comfortable. This place at the edge of human history becomes less about understanding everything and more about letting the mind settle. The weight of the stone becomes a grounding presence. The long timeline becomes a gentle backdrop. The steady accumulation of knowledge becomes a quiet hum. With everything moving slowly and predictably, the story eases into a softer state, where thinking becomes lighter and breathing becomes deeper. There is no need to follow the ideas anymore. They can drift on their own. The listener can simply rest, letting the presence of the pyramids, the land beneath them, and the discoveries that continue to emerge form a calm landscape that carries the mind towards sleep. And from this peaceful point at the edge of the story, the thoughts can continue stretching out gently without urgency, letting the calmness deepen while the rest of the world becomes quieter and softer with each moment. allowing everything to drift naturally into the space where waking thoughts fade and rest fully takes over.